So when wildlife reserves were first revealed during the Planet Zoo 2 announcement and gameplay trailer, I think a lot of us immediately focused on one thing. Animals. What animals can we release? What species can live there? And what reserves are we going to get? But after listening to Frontier's recent interview with GameReactor.eu and game director Gareth Hughes, I actually think wildlife reserves might be much bigger than that. Because the more Frontier talks about them, the less they seem to be about animals and the more they seem to be about ecosystems. And honestly, that is such a really interesting shift for Planet Zoo. Hey everyone, my name is the Lady Designer and welcome back to another Planet Zoo 2 speculation video. Today we're going to take a closer look at everything Frontier has revealed so far about wildlife reserves, discuss what they could actually play like, and explore some of the incredible real-world ecosystems that could potentially make their way into Planet Zoo 2. And if you're excited for Planet Zoo 2 and want to stay up to date with all the latest news, speculations, and discussions, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you haven't already. And if you're looking to jump back into Planet Zoo while we wait for the sequel, or you're just missing some of the DLC packs, then definitely check out Instant Gaming via the link in the description. They offer fantastic discounts on Planet Zoo, all of its DLCs, Planet Coaster 2, Prehistoric Kingdom, The Sims 4, City Skylines 2, and so many other great games. And by purchasing through their website, you'll not only get a great deal, but you'll also be supporting the channel at the same time. You can find a link to their website in the description of this video and in the pinned message of the comment section, so you can easily find it. Now, one thing that immediately stood out to me is that Gareth actually confirmed that this is something they always wanted to do in Planet Zoo 1. So apparently, wildlife reserves are much closer to the conservation system they originally envisioned, but they simply weren't able to fully realize it back then. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense. In Planet Zoo 1, we already had conservation, we had the Zoopedia, we could learn where animals live, what ecosystems they belong to, what species they live alongside, and of course we could release them into the wild. But let's be honest here for a second, most of the time releasing animals felt like just clicking a button. You breed animals, you release animals, you gain conservation credits, and then you just move on. There was definitely conservation there, but it never really felt connected to an actual ecosystem. And that seems to be exactly what Frontier wants to change with these wildlife reserves, because Gareth specifically said that these reserves are not just about releasing animals. They are about creating a natural home for those animals, a place where they can actually survive, a place where they can thrive, a place where the environment itself supports the animals living there. And that means rewilding. That means habitat restorations. That means bringing ecosystems back to life. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that immediately makes me think that wildlife reserves might be much deeper than we originally expected. Maybe you first need to restore vegetation. Maybe you need healthy water systems. Maybe you need enough biodiversity for an ecosystem to become self-sustaining. And maybe only once that ecosystem is functioning properly can it support larger predator species, like for example the lion in an African wildlife reserve. And if that is the case, this could become one of the most interesting management systems Planet Zoo has ever had, because now you're not managing individual habitats anymore, you are managing entire ecosystems, and that is a huge difference. Now, something else that I found really interesting is how Frontier decides which wildlife reserves make it into the game, because Gareth actually gave us two very important criteria. So the first one is animal diversity. Frontier wants reserves that can support aquatic animals, birds, and terrestrial animals all in the same ecosystem. And that actually tells quite a lot, because it means they are specifically looking for locations where lots of different species naturally coexist. The second thing they look at is real-world conservation projects. Places people recognize, places they've seen in documentaries, places that make people go, oh yeah, I know that place. And honestly, I absolutely love that approach, because it means wildlife reserves are not just just random maps. They are inspired by real ecosystems and real conservation efforts happening around the world. And speaking of that, let's start with the reserve we've actually seen in the gameplay trailer, the African Wildlife Reserve. Now, Frontier hasn't officially named this reserve yet, but looking at the landscape, the species, and the type of ecosystems they are building, there are a few locations that immediately come to mind. The Serengeti, the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. I'm sorry, I tried to do my research here, but I am not able to pronounce all of these areas here, so forgive me for that, please. But parts of the Great Rift Valley, and honestly, all three would make a lot of sense because these regions are famous for supporting huge numbers of species living alongside one another. And that's exactly what Frontier says they're looking for. Now, based on what we've already seen, we can already identify quite a few animals that appear to fit in this reserve. We have the plain zebra, the blue wildebeest, African elephants, Maasai giraffes, secretary birds, and potentially African lions. And depending on which species, Frontier is adding, possibly hippos as well. And honestly, that already sounds like an incredible ecosystem. But what makes it even more interesting is thinking about what animals we haven't seen yet. Because let's be real, we're still around 4 months away from launch. There is absolutely no way Frontier has revealed every animal in the game already. And if they're building an East African ecosystem, then there are so many possibilities. Could we see African buffalo, white rhinos, black rhinos, common warthogs, common ostriches, Thompson gazelles, grand gazelles, impalas, topaz, elands, water bucks, greater kudus? Maybe even predators such as cheetahs, spotted hyenas, or African wild dogs. And for the aviaries, what about vultures? Wide-backed vultures, lap-faced vultures, Ruppel's vultures. There are so many possibilities. And honestly, this is where I think wildlife reserves become really interesting because Frontier doesn't seem to be asking, what animals can we add? They seem to be asking, what ecosystems are we trying to recreate? And once you start looking at it that way, suddenly the vegetation, water system, wetlands, grasslands, and animal interactions become just as important as the species themselves. And that actually fits perfectly with what Garrett says, because every time he talks about wildlife reserves, he keeps coming back to the same themes: habitats, ecology, restoration, rewilding, environmental recovery, species interactions, not individual animals, but entire ecosystems. And honestly, if Frontier really commits to that philosophy, I think the African Reserve could become one of the most impressive parts of Planet Zoo 2. Just imagine this for a moment. You start with a degraded landscape, maybe the vegetation isn't healthy, maybe water sources need restoring, maybe there aren't enough native species yet, and gradually through restoration efforts, you begin bringing that ecosystem back to life. More plants appear, wetlands recover, birds return, herbivore population become established, and eventually you create a functioning environment capable of supporting larger species. That sounds incredibly satisfying to me. And one thing that I think is easy to overlook is just how important aquatic species could become within these reserves, because Frontier specifically mentioned wanting aquatic, avian, and terrestrial animals living within the same ecosystem. And that's actually a pretty big clue. I suggest these reserves are not simply giant safari habitats, they are complete ecosystems, which means rivers, lakes, wetlands, floodplains, and potentially entire aquatic food chains. So if we look at East Africa, suddenly species like hippos become even more interesting, crocodilians could make sense, fish species could potentially become relevant, water birds could become important, and suddenly you're not just building a savanna anymore, you're building an ecosystem. Now, moving away from Africa for a moment, there is another reserve that Frontier has already confirmed, and honestly, this one surprised me, the Scottish Highlands, because this is completely a different type of conservation story. Unlike Africa, which is all about incredible biodiversity and huge wildlife populations, the Scottish Highlands are a story about restoration, bringing species back, restoring native habitats, and rebuilding ecosystems that were lost. And honestly, the more I think about it, the more perfect it feels for wildlife reserves, because this is exactly the kind of conservation project Gareth was talking about. Not from what we've already seen and heard, we know that the Scottish Highlands Reserve includes at least a few confirmed species already. So we have the red deer, Eurasian beaver, the golden eagle, the white-tailed eagle. And immediately my brain starts to wonder what else could potentially fit here. So maybe we could see the European badgers or red foxes, European otters, Scottish wildcats, pin martens, mountain hares, red squirrels, or capercaillies. There are actually quite a lot of species that could naturally fit into this ecosystem. And then there are some really interesting long-term possibilities, because if Frontier wants to focus on restoring and rewilding species like the Eurasian lynx could become incredibly interesting. The same goes for the grey wolf. Now, considering we already have the grey wolf now being confirmed, that's pretty much a no-brainer. But also the Eurasian lynx. I mean, the Eurasian lynx was already in Planet Zoo 1, so a no-brainer here as well that is probably going to be an animal that we're going to see return and we are able to release in this wildlife reserve. And the thought of this reserve is just so fascinating, because unlike the African reserve, which feels like a thriving ecosystem already filled with wildlife, the Scottish Highlands feel more like an ecosystem that is still recovering, and that creates a completely different conservation story. Real-world rewilding projects are already happening there today. Beavers have returned, white-tailed eagles have returned, golden eagles are being protected, native forests are being restored, and there are ongoing discussions about what future restoration could look like. So from a conservation perspective, this reserve honestly feels like a perfect fit for Planet Zoo 2. And if wildlife reserves truly are focused on restoration, habitat recovery, and ecosystem health, then I think the Scottish Highland could end up becoming one of the most unique reserves in the entire game. Because instead of creating a massive African ecosystem filled with dozens of species, you might instead be rebuilding a fragile ecosystem piece by piece. So restoring forests, restoring wetlands, supporting native wildlife, and gradually watching nature return. Together with releasing your entire families that you raised in your zoos, and you see them and follow them in these amazing wildlife reserves that you created. And honestly, that sounds like exactly the kind of conservation-focused gameplay Frontier has been describing. Now, before we start looking at some completely new reserve ideas and some of the more interesting locations that could potentially appear in Planet Zoo 2, there's one mysterious location that the community recently spotted on the world map. And honestly, it might be one of the most interesting clues we have seen so far. So if you've seen screenshots of the map, you may have noticed that appears to be some kind of reserve location somewhere at the north of Madagascar around the Western Indian Ocean. Now, before we go any further, I want to stress this section is pure speculation, of course. So unlike the African Reserve and the Scottish Highlands, Frontier is not confirmed what this location actually represents. It could be a wildlife reserve, it could be an aquatic biome, it could be something completely different. But if it is a wildlife reserve, then honestly, I think it could become one of the most unique ecosystems in the entire game. Because when you look at the part of the world, there are some incredibly fascinating conservation projects taking place there. You have places like the Seychelles, the Comoros Islands, the Aldabra Atoll, a part of the Mozambique Channel, and these locations are famous for something that fits perfectly with Frontier's wildlife reserve philosophy, because there are ecosystems where marine life, bird life, and terrestrial wildlife all come together. And remember, that's exactly what Gareth said Frontier is looking for. Aquatic animals, birds, and terrestrial species all living within the same ecosystem. Now, if Frontier decided to explore a reserve in this region, the possibilities become really interesting. So for terrestrial species, you could potentially see animals inspired by island ecosystems. So the algebra giant tortoise immediately comes to mind, which is pretty much a no-brainer that it will be coming to Planet Zoo 2 at some point from the first game. Various fruit bat species could be interesting, which also makes me think like, oh, how will the bats now work? Because we had the walkthrough exhibit in the first game, but now we have aviaries, so bat species could definitely become more of an interesting feature and an animal in the game already. And they could also really work in this wildlife reserve. And depending on how broad Frontier wants to make the region, they could even draw inspiration from nearby Madagascar, of course. Now, obviously not say we're suddenly getting every Madagascar species imaginable, but it does show how much biodiversity exists within that area. And then we have the bird life. And honestly, this might be one of the strongest reasons why this region stands out. We could look at birds as the tropic birds, the fragile birds, boobies, terns, herons, flamingos, fish eagles, and countless seabird species. But just imagine creating a reserve where birds are constantly flying across coastal cliffs, nesting on islands, diving into the water, and interacting with the environment around them. Okay, this is very much wishful thinking because as of right now, we have no idea if we even are getting nests with birds, but and eggs. I mean, I really hope we're getting eggs, but just imagine that being a thing and you're just going around in this whole wildlife reserve and seeing this come to life. It sounds absolutely beautiful. And then of course we have the aquatic side. So sea turtles would obviously make perfect sense to be able to release them here. Various reef fish, of course, no-brainer. And from a conservation perspective, dugongs would actually be a fascinating addition here. Again, not because I'm predicting them, but they would just work so well in a wildlife reserve like this. So that would be such an amazing animals to have as well, because they are exactly the kind of species that are often associated with habitat protection and coastal conservation projects. And honestly, if Frontier wants to create reserves that feel completely different from one another, and tropical islands ecosystem would certainly accomplish that. Now, moving away from the Indian Ocean, let's talk about some of the most realistic reserves candidates that could potentially appear in the future. And honestly, one of the strongest candidates has to be the Everglades, because if we look at Garrett's criteria, the Everglades basically checks every single box. It's a famous ecosystem, people recognize it immediately, it's featured in documentaries, it supports aquatic species, birds and terrestrial wildlife, and it's heavily connected to conservation and habitat restoration. And honestly, it almost feels tailor-made for wildlife reserves. Now, if Frontier ever decided to create an Everglades reserve, the species possibilities are incredible. So think of the American alligators, or American crocodiles would be such an iconic reptile, or the West Indian manatees would fit perfectly with the aquatic side of the reserve. And for birds, you could have the spoonbills or storks, the great blue herons, the white ibises, numerous wetland species, and of course mammals. So think of the Florida panther or the river otter, the white-tailed deer, raccoons, bobcats, and the list can go on and on here. But what I find most interesting isn't actually the animals, it's also the ecosystem itself, because the Everglades are essentially one giant interconnected wetland. So everything influences everything else. Water flows affects vegetation, vegetation affects wildlife, wildlife affects the ecosystem, and that feels incredibly similar the way Garrett describes wildlife reserves. So honestly, if Frontier ever adds the Everglades, I think it could become one of the most immersive conservation experiences in the game. Now, another reserve that feels incredibly realistic is the Pantanal. And honestly, if you're not familiar with the Pantanal, it's basically one of the most biodiverse wetlands on Earth. It's absolutely packed with wildlife, and once again, it perfectly matches Frontier's criteria: birds, aquatic species, terrestrial animals, conservation projects, documentary recognition. It's all there, and the species list could be absolutely incredible. So jaguars would obviously be one of the star attractions. Giant otters would fit perfectly with the aquatic side of conservation. Capybaras would make a lot of sense. Lowland tapirs, marsh deer, giant anteaters, maned wolves. And for reptiles, think of the black caiman, that could be fantastic. And then there is the bird life, so think of macaques or the jabiroos, southern screamers, scarlet ibises, toko toucans, which we already have confirmed right now. Honestly, it feels like the Pantanal was almost designed for Planet Zoo. And once again, the thing that excites me the most is not any individual animal. Of course, I'm excited for the animals, but it's also the ecosystem, because that's the pattern I'm starting to notice here. Every reserve that makes sense seems to work because of how the species interact together, and not because of one specific animal. Now let's move on to a location that I know many of you would probably love to see: Yellowstone. And honestly, Yellowstone is fascinating because it represents a completely different style of ecosystem. Instead of tropical wetlands or African savannas, we're looking at mountains, forests, rivers, and grasslands. And perhaps one of the most famous ecosystem restoration stories in the world, the return of wolves. Now, before you jump into conclusions, I'm not talking about releasing wolves from zoos. I'm talking about ecosystem restoration, because Yellowstone is one of the best known examples of how restoring a species can influence an entire ecosystem. So wolf population affects elk population. That influences vegetation recovery, which then affects river systems and habitats used by other wildlife. And honestly, that's exactly the kind of interconnected ecology Frontier keeps talking about. And honestly, that's becoming the recurring theme of this entire discussion. And now let's jump back across the Atlantic to Europe, because there is another reserve that makes an incredible amount of sense: the Danube Delta. And if you've never looked at the Danube Delta before, it is one of Europe's most important wetland ecosystems. Massive bird colonies, countless fish species, large mammals, protected habitats, conservation projects, everything Frontier seems to be interested in. Now, from a wildlife perspective, the Danube Delta is absolutely loaded with possibilities. Think of the Dalmatian pelican, great white pelicans, glossy ibises, Eurasian spoonbills, gray herons, purple herons, great egrets. The bird life alone could make this reserve feel completely unique. For mammals, Eurasian otters would fit perfectly. Golden jackals could be interesting, wild boars, roe deer, red deer, and potentially European bison if Frontier ever explores nearby restoration projects. And once again, the reserve itself would offer something completely different from Africa, Scotland, Yellowstone, or the Everglades, which is exactly why I think it feels so realistic. Because every reserve we're discussing offers a completely different conservation story. Now, there are a few other locations that I think deserve at least a quick mention. So that will be the Okavango Delta, one of Africa's most famous wetlands ecosystem, the Amazon Basin, one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, and the Sundarbans, an incredible mangrove ecosystem famous for Bengal tigers and coastal wildlife. And honestly, the more examples we look at, the more one thing becomes clear: Frontier has an enormous number of options. Because once you stop focusing on individual animals and start focusing on ecosystems, the possibilities become almost endless. And that is exactly why I think wildlife reserves have the potential to become one of the biggest features Planet Zoo 2 has ever introduced. Because unlike habitats, which usually focus on a handful of animals, wildlife reserves seem designed to tell the story of entire ecosystems, and that completely changes how we think about conservation gameplay. Now, there's one final topic I want to discuss, and I know it's a topic that always generates a lot of discussion within the community. So let's talk about cetaceans and how they may or may not fit into the wildlife reserve system. ecosystem. And before anyone panics in the comment section, I'm not here to argue whether cetaceans should or should not be added in Planet Zoo 2. That is not what this video is about. Instead, I just want to look at it purely through the lens of wildlife reserves, because after listening to Gareth talk about conservation, restoration, ecosystems, and rewilding, I actually think wildlife reserves gives us an interesting new way of looking at this topic. Now, something worth remembering is that Frontier previously released a statement regarding cetaceans, and one thing that stood out to me was that they specifically mentioned conservation research and rewilding programs. Now, I'm not saying that means cetaceans are confirmed, far from it, but when you combine that statement with everything Garrett is now saying about wildlife reserves, there does seem to be an interesting overlap here. Because what I find fascinating is that many real-world marine conservation projects focus on ecosystems rather than individual species. So coastal waters, estuaries, protected bays, river systems, marine reserves, habitat restoration, those are often the things conservationists focus on first, and then the species benefit from those protections. And honestly, that sounds very similar to the philosophy Frontier keeps describing for wildlife reserves, because the more Garrett talks about these reserves, the more it sounds like the ecosystem itself is the priority. The environment comes first, the habitat comes first, the restoration becomes first, and then the wildlife follows. And this is where I think the conservation around cetaceans become really interesting. Now, I will say that it could be very interesting if Frontier ever decided to expand Planet Zoo's focus further into animal rehabilitation, rescue work, or sanctuary management in the future. Those are all important parts of real-world conservation, and they could potentially make for some fascinating gameplay. But I guess at this point, that's really just wishful thinking on my part. It's not something Frontier has confirmed. It's not what wildlife reserves currently appear to be designed around. So rather than asking whether cetaceans could fit into a sanctuary or rehabilitation gameplay system that Frontier has never mentioned, I think the more interesting question is whether there are marine ecosystems that could fit within the same conservation-focused philosophy Frontier is using for wildlife reserves as we know right now. And honestly, that's why I find this topic interesting. Not because I think cetaceans are likely, not because I think they are planned, and definitely not because I think they are confirmed, but because wildlife reserves seem to be built around conservation philosophy that prioritizes ecosystems first. So if Frontier ever explores larger marine ecosystems in the future, I think the most important question may not actually be what species could be added. Instead, it might be what ecosystems are they trying to recreate? And honestly, I think that's a much more interesting question, because if wildlife reserves truly are ecosystem based, then any future marine species would likely need to fit naturally within those conservation focused environments. And again, this isn't a prediction, it's simply just looking at how real world conservation often works and comparing that to the themes Frontier has actually discussed. And honestly, I find that fascinating, because wildlife reserves aren't just adding new maps, they're adding an entirely different philosophy to Planet Zoo, a different way of looking at conservation, a different way of looking at animal management, a different way of looking at habitats, and also a different way of looking at ecosystems, and potentially even a different way of looking at species that have traditionally been considered difficult to represent in zoo games. Now, the more I listen to Garrett's talk about wildlife reserves, the more I think we might be looking at a completely different endgame for Planet Zoo 2. Because if you think about Planet Zoo 1, the ultimate goal was often creating the perfect zoo, building beautiful habitats, breeding animals, earning conservation credits, creating guest experiences. And there was absolutely nothing wrong about that. I mean, hello, I played 3,500 hours of Planet Zoo. I loved it so much. And in fact, it's one of the reasons we all love Planet Zoo. But Wildlife Reserve seems to be asking a very different question. Not, can you build the perfect zoo, but can you restore nature? Can you rebuild an ecosystem? Can you restore a landscape? Can you create an environment where wildlife can thrive? Can you bring a damaged ecosystem ecosystem back to life. Wishful thinking here, guys. We don't know if this is going to be the case, but I just love to think about this idea. And honestly, if that's what wildlife reserves become, I think this could be one of the biggest evolutions Planet Zoo has ever seen. Because now you're not simply managing habitat, you're managing ecological relationships. You're not simply placing animals, you're thinking about biodiversity. You're not simply designing exhibits, you're restoring environments. And that's a completely different gameplay experience. Now, obviously, we still have a lot of unanswered questions. How exactly will restoration work? How much control will we have over these ecosystems? Will vegetation recovery matter? Will water quality matter? Will water dry in hotter climates? How are you going to deal with that? Will species interactions matter? Will reserves evolve over time? Can ecosystems fail? Can ecosystems recover? There are so many things we don't know, but honestly, that's part of what makes this feature so exciting and this whole journey towards the launch of the game, and why I genuinely think wildlife reserves may end up being one of the biggest surprises in Planet Zoo 2, because it fundamentally changes what conservation means within the game. And honestly, that is what excites me the most. The African reserves look incredible, the Scottish Highlands look fascinating, and the mysterious Indian Ocean location could be extremely interesting. And hopefully we're going to see things like the Everglades, the Pantanal, Yellowstone, Danube Delta, Okavango Delta, the Sundarbans, the Amazon. There are so many incredible ecosystems Frontier could potentially explore. For the first time, conservation might become something we actively experience, not something to click, not something that happens in the background, not something represented by a number, but something we actually build, something we restore, something we watch grow over time. And honestly, if Frontier can pull that off, I think wildlife reserves could become one of the defining features of Planet Zoo 2. But of course, these are just my thoughts based on everything we know right now and a lot of speculation. And we still have around 4 months until launch, which means Frontier has plenty of time to reveal more reserves, more animals, and hopefully a lot more information about how these systems actually work. And honestly, I cannot wait to learn more. But now I want to hear from you guys. What wildlife reserve would you love to see in Planet Zoo 2? Would you choose the Everglades, the Pantanal, Yellowstone, the Danube Delta, Amazon, etc.? Or do you have an entirely different ecosystem in mind? And perhaps even more importantly, what do you think wildlife reserves will actually play like? Do you think we'll simply release animals into them? Or do you think Frontier is building something much deeper than this? Let me know your thoughts down below, because I would genuinely love to hear what you guys think. And if you enjoyed today's speculation video, then don't forget to leave a like of this video. Subscribe, of course, if you haven't already, and make sure to ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future Planet Zoo 2 news and all my other Planet Zoo content. Thank you all so much for watching, and I really do hope to see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys!